In addition to thanking Rachel, I need to thank Galactic Village Games. Galactic Village is a small independent game studio located in Chelmsford, Mass. And they are allowing me to talk about an unreleased game. So you are getting a sneak preview of Galactic Village, and you're getting an insight into some of the development process, which, I don't know. If you haven't seen the computer game industry before, it might be a little scary. So are there people here who don't play computer games at all? Some, not as many as I thought there might be. People who play, now computer games means a lot of things these days. I'm including cell phone games, maybe like Angry Birds. Social games like Farmville. Anybody playing any of those games? Okay. Wii Fit, Guitar Hero, anything like that? Cool games. Hardcore games, real-time strategy, Call of Duty, that kind of thing. Oh, there's a hardcore core here. Ooh. How about grand strategy or management kind of games like Civilization? Oh. You know what? You guys are actual part of our target audience, so we'll especially like to collect up your observations at the end of this. Okay, so the title of the talk is From Natural Gesture to Game User Interface. And so the really big disclaimer here is that we are not doing Kinect, or any of these technologies that are gesture recognition technologies, like potentially in the future. However, if there's any Kinect developers here, is there any? I have a question for Kinect developers later on, if there are any. So we'll at least use the word again tonight. So what I'm really going to do is I'm going to introduce natural human gesture as we see it on the street and in the lab. And in particular in the lab, I'm going to talk about natural gesture in the Truffles Corpus, which is a resource that I created and use for natural language research. And then I'm going to go on to talk about how looking into that topic of natural human gesture influenced Galactic Village. So we'll get to this in a second. If somebody had asked me about natural human gesture a few years ago, what I probably would have thought of is like a thumbs up or a high five or waving. I probably would have thought about the fact that there are some gestures in our culture that may be rude or offensive in another culture, and vice versa. That's a topic that seems to come up more recently now that we have more contact with the Muslim world. But it turns out that's not the whole story. In poking around dusty academic research labs, I learned that people gesture when they talk. They do it all the time, no matter what their natural language is, what country in the world they're from. And not only that, they have a really hard time preventing themselves from doing that. And just to give you an example that's not me, let's have a look at Lucy here. So this, of course, is Lucille Ball, the actress. And the clip that I'm going to show you, however, is not acting. In this case, she's appearing as a panelist on a game show. And so the agenda is given, but the dialogue is not scripted. So this is spontaneous human communication. And I'll just play this a couple times and loop around.
I got to ask her a question, huh? Well, what was the clue? What was the clue?
Something that she made.
I got to ask her a question, huh? Well, what was the clue? What was the clue?
Something that she made.
I got to ask her a question, huh? Well, what was...
Okay, let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. I'm going to just go through it frame by frame. Twirl, 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 twirl. 4 twirls. And then she closes her hand and moves on to other things. The people who I met in the academic research world in the lab of Professor David McNeil at the University of Chicago were sure that gesture was a very important part of communication and that it often communicates specific meaning. But you look at something like this and you say, you know, I'm not exactly sure what is being communicated there. It's really pretty intriguing. And what I wanted to know is at the time, is there enough there, meaning in gesture, that you could use it in a natural language understanding system somehow? And I investigated further and learned pretty quickly that it was a really difficult problem. Adam Kendon, who started studying gesture way back in the 60s, by the end of the 1980s, had developed a concept of a spectrum of gesture types. And the gestures that we make when we talk, we'll refer to going forward as co-speech gestures. He said those are way at one end of the continuum. The reason being that these are completely spontaneous gestures. They have no concrete vocabulary, no grammar. They don't participate in larger constructs in any systematic way. And you can't understand them without the accompanying speech. So right there, you can see there are a few problems for natural language understanding. It's like, OK, great. OK, great. But there's still something there. What's there? And just to continue for a second with the continuum, kind of around the middle of the continuum, you have the kind of gestures I was originally thinking about, the thumbs up and so on, which Kendon referred to as emblems. So that's probably the only jargon I'm going to throw at you tonight, is normal gestures. He's calling emblems. And we have in our culture a certain vocabulary of these, which we're all familiar with. And at the same time, they don't really participate in any larger grammars. You don't necessarily have speech with them. You don't require speech with them. They're just these like units that are kind of out there. Okay. At the other end of the continuum, we have what they call primary sign languages, like American Sign Language, where it is the language of communication for some culture or community. And signs in primary sign languages have a large vocabulary, just as we do in English. I know that there's several thousand signs, at least in ASL, although I had a hard time coming up with a number just to give you a reference. They have a rich grammar, just as we, speaking English, have a rich grammar. And I'm going to say, as Kendon did, that they're non-speech signs. The reason I kind of slide over that is because you will often hear sign language presented with a spoken interpretation, but it's not like you can have one conversation in spoken language and another with your hands. It'd be very difficult to do that because of constraints on your working memory. And people mine American Sign Language now for 20, 30 years for insights into what language consists of. Do you guys know what sign language looks like? I'll just play a little bit for you real quick. Do we have actually skilled signers in the room? Oh. So you've actually studied sign as a foreign language, essentially. Oh, so you can keep an eye on me, yeah? Yeah. She's native, you can talk to her. Okay, awesome. I actually, a while back, thought I should have an example if somebody's here that I can ask them to do. But I don't have a specific, like, I don't know, what? It's time to do your homework? Can you do that? Can you do that? Okay, can you say that in English sort of the way you did that? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Applause. I saw applause. I know that one. Okay, so I never studied sign. I only know what linguists know about sign. I did have the opportunity to visit the National Technical Institute for the Deaf a few months ago and got my first real big introduction to deaf culture. So I'm starting to get a little bit of insight, but I'll just, has courses, yeah. And I hear BU has a terrific program too. Okay. Okay, okay, yeah. So maybe I can kind of skip over this example, but I'll at least tell you what it was about. So without going home with any fellow CHI people, if you wanted to take 10 minutes and go to YouTube and look for the pilot episode of My Deaf Family, you could see a little more of how sign is used in casual environments. And this was something that the actress Marlee Matlin put together. She thought a reality TV show about a deaf family would be so much more valuable than some of the other reality TV shows that are out there. What I really wanted, hoping that people would notice about sign is just how dense it is, in the sense that you've got this rapid sequence of signs. There's a lot of spatial components to the sign. There's both hands, the hand shapes, the motion of the hands. There's the eyebrows. There's where the person is looking. There's whether they're using their mouth with shapes to support lip reading, all kinds of stuff. And I guess maybe I will play this because it's easier than not playing it, but just 30 seconds. Audio.
I mean, when they found out I was deaf, well, they were kind of devastated. They sent me to a mainstream school where they had an oral program, and they fitted me with these big, unwieldy hearing aids that were really annoying. But it wasn't until I got into middle school before I saw the difference between oral and sign language.
That's just going to move. So again, what I hope you're getting out of this is the density of the encoding for sign language as opposed to co-speech gesture. And you will see more complicated use of co-speech gesture. If somebody's continuously talking, you'll see quite a long sequence of gestures that you didn't see in the Lucy clip. But you won't see that kind of density that you see in sign. And from a technology point of view, when we're working on user interfaces, little gesture interfaces maybe, typically we're working in this space where we have a small vocabulary, a simple grammar, so we're kind of between emblems and signs. Next month we should all come and ask the harmonics guy about how far harmonics goes in the direction of not having a vocabulary. My experience of using and seeing games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band and then some of the Wii games is that there is an underlying set of actions that you can perform. They just happen to have more of a time factor in them than many of our other user interface gestures. So that's just a really quick observation on the way to more natural gesture. In a particular, co-speech gesture in the Truffles Corpus. So like I mentioned, the Truffles Corpus is a video corpus that I collected to work on studying human language and human communication. And when I got interested in gesture again, I turned back to this corpus. It's 8 hours of single camera video with high quality lapel mic audio. The pairs of students were recruited together. They are friends, and therefore they are much quicker to move into casual conversation than you would get if you were pairing up strangers and recording them. And we asked them to do a small manual task, a cooking task actually, making chocolate truffles, surprise, surprise. And in order to do that task, they had to read the recipe, figure out what they were going to do, divide up the work, round up the ingredients and the equipment, and follow the recipe and wash up. And in the process of that, they gesture. Okay, so we have this reusable reference corpus of 8 hours of video that has some gesture in it. And one example of gesture that's in there, this is the general kind of stuff that you see in this corpus. You see people cooking in a kitchen, and in this particular gesture, there's a couple things to notice. So Jenny's holding up this truffle. So she's got something in her hand. And she's doing essentially then two things at the same time. One is, by holding up the truffle and displaying it, she's communicating, she's drawing your attention to it. You know, kind of like pointing. You use your hand, but the idea isn't to look at your hand, it's to get your attention to somewhere else. And this gesture was typical of a whole set of gestures which we saw in the corpus, where people made their gestures while their hands were actually involved in the task or were actually busy. So you get things like, I tabulated a kind of a list of some for you, for example. Oh, sorry, let's play the video real quick. Look, yeah. Okay. So that is a co-speech gesture as it happens. Other gestures we saw that were hands-busy gestures, this is a sampling. If somebody has a wire whisk in their hand, maybe they'll point with the whisk. You're not surprised, are you? You're not surprised at all. You knew that you did this. Maybe they tap with a whisk to call attention to something. We had quite a lot of these displays. Jenny and Lisa, in particular, did a whole bunch of the display gestures. We had one really awesome gesture where in the recipe is talking about how the first step is to make the chocolate ganache that's then going to be chilled and rolled into balls. And this guy, whose hands are both busy doing something, I think he has a towel, he's like, yeah, you know, that's the kind of person who would call something a ganache. And he does this shimmy with his whole body because his hands are occupied. So he's using his body to communicate this extra information because his hands aren't free. And we have, you know, that's an easy one. A shrug is more like one of our classic emblems. You see that with full hands as well. And there are others. I didn't count them, but that display gesture is a good example of something that we saw where the hands were busy. Here's a different category of gestures. And I put pantomime in quotes because pantomime apparently has a couple other technical meanings if you're in theater. I mean, there's the obvious kind of Marcel thing I think that we might be familiar with, the Marcel Marceau type of pantomime, which is a rehearsed pantomime which has no accompanying speech and dramatizes some activity. Apparently there's an older tradition of pantomime in theater too that I won't even attempt to categorize. But when I say pantomime, what I mean is going through the motions of something. And we had in this corpus not only the specific example, but a bunch of tabulated examples again. But let's look at this one. OK, so this guy on the left-hand side here, he's got spoons in both hands. And he's scooping chocolate. But he's telling a story about how he cut his finger the other day. And this is what he says.
My can opener disintegrated. My little hand can opener disintegrated right in my hand. And my can opener disintegrated. My little hand can opener disintegrated right in my hand. And my can opener disintegrated. My little...
OK, so this is a very quick gesture. Maybe somebody who's really skilled in sign might be able to see that stuff a little better than we can see it. Very quick gesture. If you hear him and you know he's talking about a little can opener, you can see that can opener. OK, so the left hand is holding the handles of the can opener, and the right hand is doing the twisty thing. There's the second twist, and now it's down. I guess I should. I'm going to back up, play that again. That's in reverse. OK, here it is forward. Twist, twist, and down. That whole thing takes 400 milliseconds, less than half a second. Twist, twist. It's because it's a very small motion. It's that top line in the table there. It's a very small motion. It goes very quickly. If you had a gesture that was more of an arm gesture, it would take longer because you have to move further. The other really striking thing about these pantomimes was I didn't include any examples where this is not the case, but a lot of them involved repetitive motion. And so I wrote out the number of repetitions in some of these cases. And you see we've got a couple of them where there's actually 5 repetitions, as many as 5. This particular 6 repetitions actually had some invisible internal structure. It was like 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So there seemed to be this kind of natural limit at around 5. And after that, you would end up having some internal structure to it. And so this, when I'm looking in terms of natural language understanding, I thought, hey, wow, this is an area where you might really have a chance to do some gesture recognition. You might have a chance to think that there's some kind of, if you limited your domain down to just cooking, and there was only so many cooking implements, and you knew what they all were, and you knew how to use them all, if you had really good domain knowledge, you might be able to start recognizing these gestures, especially if you were able to take advantage of the co-occurring speech. So that's where I started to see like a glimmer of hope that you might, in some future day, be able to do natural language understanding with co-speech type gestures. But the real takeaways about these pantomime gestures are the repetitive motion, the time scale varying over depending on what the size of the gesture is, and the fact that they serve a wide variety of discourse purposes. It's not as if they were only just teaching you how to do something. In that very first example, he was telling a story, and he was illustrating the story. We had cases of pantomiming rolling a dough ball to say, are we going to do it like this? Is this right? And other cases where it was instruction. We had this case with the sifter. He was trying to think of the word, and eventually his partner thought of the word. And psychology people have some reasons that they want to care about that. But that's a completely different kind of use of gesture to help in lexical retrieval. And then there's all these other types of illustration here. So with the pantomime gestures, we saw not only the repetition, but the fact that, it's not like they have one specific purpose. It's just a resource that you use to serve the purposes that you have at hand. Now, one other thing that we saw in the Truffles Corpus was people communicating about sizes. And we have a nice resource here because basically what happened is there's a step in the recipe that says, take a lump of ganache and roll it between your palms into walnut-sized balls. Just about every pair talked about that size and how big that's supposed to be, and is it supposed to be this big or that big, and stuff like that. It was a concept that needed some thought. And I think part of the reason is people aren't really sure exactly how big is a walnut. They know about additional constraints from cooking, like things melting and blending into each other. And not only that, but walnuts aren't a consistent size. Even an individual walnut isn't spherical. So it's a difficult subject, this size thing. But the point is, some of the time when they discussed it, they illustrated the size, as this guy is doing. And a few of our people did that, and they used a couple of different hand shapes to do it. Sign person has to back me up on this. My understanding is that you can't say this in sign for a truffle. And the reason is that if you say this, you're talking about a flat thing, like a coin. If you say this and you curl your fingers around, then you have a spherical thing. And it's really deeply embedded in sign, this concept of classifiers, these different shapes that you make to illustrate things. But they're a vocabulary of those shapes. It's not improvised in the main line of sign. You can improvise around it, but these shapes are standardized in sign. So that's the difference in the coding density between sign that has to be able to handle both cases and this spontaneous gesture, which only needs to handle what we're talking about right now in this situation where you know what object I mean. Okay, so now that your head is totally full of observations, let me just say real quickly that what I hope to do in the future is not only to try to refine more these categories of gesture and characterize them well enough that we can study them in little units, but also to understand a lot better how gesture, when it encodes quantitative information like size, how it does it and how we human beings are able to recognize it. And that's a little bit different than what people do when they're trying to get technology to recognize it. But I want to know how our human visual system is able to make the judgments that are necessary. So, from the point of view of Galactic Village, the real bottom line with these observations was, firstly, that we see hands busy gestures. Secondly, we see this use of repetition in the pantomimes. And thirdly, we see actual quantitative information being communicated. Okay, so gestures in Galactic Village, what about that? I will get there, but I'm going to take a detour, just a short detour into usability and games. Introduce games. Usability and game design. So looking really, really grossly at usability, we have this one really bad category of software from a usability point of view, where the software was just too frustrating and the user gave up and that was the end of that story. And how many of you have ever worked on a product that met that fate? I guess I shouldn't name names right now. Maybe what I think of as maybe our nightmare as usability people is software that's learnable but painful. Software that just isn't designed with the constraints of human beings in mind. You can manage to do something with it, but you will always, always, always make mistakes. And the only reason you continue is because you have to use this stuff for your job or something. What we hope for is, with complex software, that it just works once you learn it. Or, and I suspect this applies more in the webby world or maybe the cell phone world, that we can achieve this ideal of it just works the first time and you don't even think about how it works or stop to figure it out. And probably as practitioners, a lot of the time we're mucking around making little trade-offs between, well, if I learn this, it will annoy me later on? If it works the first time, is it going to be inconvenient the second time? Things like that. But in computer games, it's this one other type of usability without which you don't have a game. You have to have a good experience or you don't have a game. You have to have a compelling experience. And backing off again very far to the top level, there's probably a lot of ways to innovate in computer games. I'm going to talk about just two. One way to innovate is to have some technology and then say, well, what can I do with this technology? What is the absolute coolest thing that I can do with my technology? And there was a company a while back, a game studio called DMA Design, and they had a city simulation. And okay, they were already in the business of developing games. They had some ideas about what would make a good game and what didn't, and they decided to do a city simulation. Once they had this technology, they just sort of messed around with it for a while to see what was cool in their game. Does anybody know what game this is? No? City? Good try, good try. It was Grand Theft Auto. Okay. Stealing cars just turned out to be the coolest thing you could do in that game, or one of the cool things that you could do in that game. And of course, they put a lot of stuff around that, There's different levels of challenge in the different capers that you're required to do to rise up through the crime hierarchy and so on. But that's how they developed the game. That's where the core of their game came from, was they had the technology, what is cool about it? Another way to develop games, and I'm not picking sides here yet, is just to say, what experience do I want to provide? And then do whatever it takes to support that experience. And a game that I'll put in that category, there was a game studio that, as many beginning game studios did, was doing a lot of contract work for other organizations. And they wanted to get more into developing their own games rather than other people's games. And they had a point in their schedule where they had the resources to do that. They said, okay, team, we want everybody's ideas what's going to be a really good game that we should do for this next game. And I guess they did know kind of what platform they were implementing on and a couple things like that. And they had this wonderful set of criteria for how they were going to choose their next game. Well, out of all the ideas that their team submitted, there was one that was just so juicy. It was a picture of a bird walking around. And this bird, okay, what game is this? Angry Birds, okay. I wasn't able to find the original motivating picture for Angry Birds. But they said, this character, it's such a great character. What are we going to do with this character? And I guess the answer is slingshots and all kinds of stuff. So they just took that vibe, that feeling, that idea, and milked it for all it was worth. They wanted to create an experience around that image. So Galactic Village has an experience that it wants you to have. Galactic Village is a massively multiplayer online strategy game in which you are an immortal demigod, you have your own tribe of worshipers, and we want you to look forward to checking in on your tribe as it grows and starts to have interactions with neighboring tribes, and you in the game start to have interactions with neighboring players and so forth. We want the experience that we want you to have is partly that we want you to enjoy exploring and looking around and checking on your tribe and growing your tribe. And so when I joined Galactic Village, I thought maybe we would do a speech interface to Galactic Village. Was not in the cards. Did not contribute to that experience in any way. Didn't do that. Because Galactic Village is at some level a grand strategy game and a resource management game, it has this inherent risk to it. It has a lot of numbers, and it could easily devolve into a spreadsheet game. And I have played strategy games that are like that. So the experience that we're trying to support is to have it be more of an immersive experience and less of a spreadsheet. And with this goal of keeping it immersive, and I guess parenthetically, I should just remind you that with a massively multiplayer online game, you're sitting at a computer. So you have a screen with a regular WIMP interface and a mouse and a keyboard and actually 2 and 3D graphics in the case of Galactic Village. You can see the parchment-colored scrolls are 2D graphics, and everything else in that picture is 3D graphics. So the goal is to have not too many parchment scrolls, have you more immersed in the game. So part of the design is also that all those little people and things that you see in the game are because it's a strategy game, we refer to them as units. And in a military strategy game, unit would mean like tanks or bases or things like that. In this case, you see a couple units, one of which is an explorer and one of which is a merchant. And we use animation to show you what activities they're doing. So the merchant, if the merchant does a trade, there's an animation for that. If the explorer is wandering around exploring, there's an animation for that. We also use animation occasionally for providing feedback. And in particular, when you, as an immortal demigod, give orders to your units, you get the feedback of them acknowledging the order. So in the game, you see animations like this. Okay, iterating now, going around again. Acknowledging an order and performing an activity which just so happens to be resting. So it's kind of a boring activity, but. One thing that might jump out at you is the use of hands busy gesture. And I would like to say that was a clever intellectual thing that we did, but it was not a clever intellectual thing that we did. We did it for completely practical reasons, the same reason that people do hands busy gesture in real life, which is these guys had to carry around stuff anyway, and in some cases it was tied into their activities, in some cases less so. A really slick version of that acknowledge order gesture would be if the explorer would take his telescope and pass it into his other hand before doing listening and acknowledging order, because what he's supposed to be doing is cupping his hand behind his ear and then nodding. So you don't really get the cup part with the telescope there, but I think you get the general acknowledgement effect, right, because of the nodding. So we don't have Kinect developers here. Anybody who's played with the Kinect? Okay, a bunch of those. The Kinect software development kit, as it's shipped by Microsoft, provides some skeletons for the 3D animations. And I mention this because those skeletons are very similar to the skeletons used by these guys. They only have 28 bones or joints. It's not that many. They have a shoulder joint. They have an elbow joint. They have a wrist joint. They have no joints in the hands. Okay? That hand shape that you get, you're kind of stuck with. Now, maybe, I haven't looked at it carefully, maybe Microsoft does something a little bit clever with that. What we do is we choose a hand shape that's pretty versatile. So we're working with approximately the level of resolution that the Kinect has. And in the service of this goal of trying to provide you a more immersive experience, we considered the idea that maybe we could use the things that we saw in natural gesture to help convey all these different status variables that the little units have. And I should say there are 8 status variables that a unit can have. Any given unit doesn't have more than 4 of those, and probably maybe only 2 or 3. Okay, so there's all these pieces of information associated with a unit, and we thought that we might just be able to put those over using gesture. So we did an initial design based on arm gestures, because we couldn't do hand gestures. And we thought, well, maybe because of this repetition thing, maybe we can use the repetitions to convey quantities. Because we know that we can have up to 5 of them. And we know that the stats behind the scenes are numbers like percents. We don't want to inflict percents on the player at any time. Really, we just want to tell them something much more qualitative. Very good, good, maybe neutral, poor, very poor. So we designed a set of gestures with the idea that there would be 5 values for any given variable, and that those gestures would have to be distinguishable using your arms. And because there's 8 variables with 5 values apiece, that gives you a total of 40 different signs. When I talk about scales, what I mean is something like this. If you have something like prosperity, and say you decide that you're going to do prosperity using kind of a money counting gesture, in that case, you can think of something like showing very little money is very little gesture, and then showing much more money is much more repetitions. So I call that a one-sided scale, one-tailed scale, because you go kind of from 0 out in one direction, positive. There were some that we thought were more appropriate as a 2-tailed scale, where the center would be kind of at 0, but then there would be a positive direction and a negative direction, such as the food supply, where we knew for a fact that if you had no food, you were going to die. The unit will die if it has very low food. So there's kind of a neutral maintenance number, and then there's numbers where you're actually stockpiling and have food that you can use in the future. So in the original gesture set design, we had some that were one-tailed sets and some that were 2-tailed scales. We did our prototyping with little sketches of stick figures, and we did it with acting it out, just as I just was doing there. And then we did a test for ease of recognition. And I wonder if I have time to tell you about a lot of the details of that test. So what we did was a survey, and the way we did this survey is we went to UPA's Halloween meeting in costumes and did the gestures in costumes to look like the units, and asked people if they could recognize the gestures. Well, we asked them a little bit more carefully than that. We said things like, if this is a unit that has health status, food status, and prosperity status, and you see this doing this sequence of gestures, what level of prosperity do you think it has? And we asked some other questions too, like, if you see a unit doing a gesture like this, what variable do you think it is? And stuff like that. And what we really wanted was for people to be able to just see right off in every case what it means. And what we found was that there was a basic solid core that people could recognize, kind of what we wanted them to recognize. So the approach seemed promising. There were several specific issues. One issue was that if you had, say, a two-tailed scale, well, actually, by that point, we had, by the point where we actually subjected the gestures to that usability test, we had realized that there was a problem. If you had a two-tailed 5-valued scale with a 0 in the middle, it was very hard to get a distinctive gesture for that kind of neutral value. So what you found was confusion between that neutral value for one variable and this neutral value for some other variable. There wasn't a lot of distinguishing information. So what we did was we chopped out the zeros out of the two-tailed ones. And after the UPA test, we decided we had to chop zeros out of the one-tailed ones, too. In fact, we didn't like how the one-tailed ones work and redesigned them as two-tailed so that you could always tell when your unit was suffering a lack of something. And in parallel with redesigning the gesture set, we did some prototype animations and supporting game programming to be able to start testing out the idea in game. And you're going to see really quickly, well, actually, you're going to see video, which is hot off the presses. And in order to do this, I have to jump out of the presentation here and switch screens. One of the things you're going to see is that we need to start doing our usability tests at the bottom of a stairwell. And the reason is that our in-game use cases look like this. So the player's off doing something. The player decides it's time to check in on these units. They have to move the field of view to where they can actually see these little guys. In this particular version, we had the programming be that the player mouses over, and I'll play that again in a second. The way what that was designed to test was the player mouses over a unit, the unit starts its animation, then the player goes down to mouse out over others, they start their animation cycle. And then you can kind of see all at once what's going on with the different units if you can figure out where to put your attention. And so what jumped out of that as a design requirement is we want it to be really obvious if a unit needs attention. And there's a couple of ways you can go in designing to support that. But probably what we ought to, I'll play that one more time, and then I'll play you something that's a little bit more of a close-up so that you can see that in more detail. So these two orange guys are militias, and that's why they carry pitchforks, is because they fight with pitchforks. Our animations are done, these test animations were done in-house. Normally we outsource our art. There's a couple artifacts in the animations. What I think you're supposed to be able to see is that first militia guy. Is it better if I'm in the light or not in the light? Out of the light, okay. So that first militia guy, for his first status, he's doing something like this. And that's a health status. For a second one, he's doing this. So that's a food status. So he's got bad health and good food. The second militia has the bad health, and then he has bad food, too. And we'll see those guys a little bit closer up in this other animation here. I think it's a little bit confusing in that our second militia, he's busy defending with his pitchfork, so it's a little bit distracting. But oh, and should I get that? See if I can get that out of the way here. More. I don't have the fine grain control in this particular player, so I can't do, the nice frame by frames for you. But is that enough of that one? We'll go back and do the other one real quick once. Oops. Oh, okay. So, yeah, good point. You're always viewing these guys from above. Some of these gestures need to be adjusted to take that into account. All the design work we did up till now, we didn't really take that into account. Oopsie. So what we need to do is get the entire population of UPA and put them at the top of a stairwell and put our costume guys at the bottom of the stairwell and see if they can look down at the head of our costume guys and find out what gestures they're doing. Okay, I'm going to do just one more on that, the one with the big zoom in. Okay.
What's the benefit of having to mouse over them to get them started instead of having everybody announcing their status all the time?
Well, for one thing, you'd want to see them doing their activities. For another thing, there's also the fact that we don't want to animate at all if you're not really looking at it. So we want to save cycles. So there's a number of ways in which we can decide that you're not really looking at it. So we have to do one first initial thing, which is figure out whether you're looking at it at all, whether it's on your screen displaying visible, to know to do some animation. Then the animation that we prefer is they should be doing their activity. It's only if you want to drill down into their statuses that we really want to do this other little set of cycles. Which brings up a design question. I'm glad you asked that. The question being, well, what about if you had the unit attract your attention if it needed help, and then you could drill down and look in and see what kind of help it needs? That would be another good use case. And the question is, how much time, are we going to throw a lot of resources into developing this feature and figuring out how to really use it well, or are we going to decide it's not working well enough for us and bag it? Or just that we have something. Now, didn't mean to do that. Fun fact about game design, or I guess not so fun fact, the sad reality of computer game development is that good ideas are a dime a dozen. People are known to say, you're never going to ship a game at all unless you can kill the vast majority of your good ideas, because otherwise you're going to be implementing till the end of time. We just did this. We just saw all this video. We're moving on to the next slide. So what we really ought to be doing right now, the best thing to do right now with that current state of hot off the presses in-game video, the best thing to do would be to take that prototype off of the development machine, put it out there onto the test server, and let the regular game test servers live with it for a little while, along with the other activities that they're doing, and see what kind of feedback you get from them. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Do they want to see more? Do they not notice? Do you need to force them to notice by turning off your other sources of that very same information? And that would be really the next thing to do, is to do a quick and dirty test of the general appeal of that feature and whether you can see the units enough of the time to make it worthwhile, depending on what you're doing in the gameplay. So we really need to check the visibility and the appeal of that feature. Then we continue to buff it, refine the 4x8 character, 4x8 gesture set, continue to tweak the game programming to support it, and then prioritize it in the list of all the things we want to do to build the game. So that's where we're at with this particular feature. And now let's ask, which ideas from the gesture world did we actually end up using, assuming that we go ahead with the game feature? And well, guess what? We're using the hands busy gesture, like it or not. We did see that the units can use gestures to show parameter values. We think 32 distinct signs is probably a lot better than 40 as far as being able to work out a whole set that can be recognized. This idea of repetition really is something that people can take advantage of immediately to get qualitative information, but it doesn't really convey numeric information. It's much more like sign language in that regard. And the reason I say this is I've been running around asking the sign linguists whether there's any case in which sign language uses space to express quantities. And you end up with most of them saying most of the time that you can express that a quantity is large or small, but in order to express accurately quantities, what you have to do is the same thing that we do in spoken languages, which is use a number generating system and not just space. So that's what we've been able to do with gesture. I cannot tell you when the game will launch, but if you want to be a beta tester, you can email us at galacticvillage.com and get on the list. And that's all I have to tell you today. I'll be happy to answer questions.
We have a microphone. I tried to turn it on, but we have a mic, so
I don't think, there we go. So get my attention if you want to ask a question.
So how much of the stuff that they do in the games is affected by newer technologies like those motion algorithms in Second Life and things like that, where it seems like you're interacting with a character, but you're really not? I mean, do you actually worry just about the gesture or the interaction with the other person? I guess is my question.
Let's see. I'm not sure if I understood the question. I'm not. So what you're talking about is Second Life is a massively multiplayer environment. I have an avatar in that environment. Right. You have an avatar in that environment. We both have a view of those things.
Right.
And so I can see in this virtual world what I do and what you do. And if we want, we can do something like a high five.
Right.
But the response time is such that it makes it a little tricky. Right? That's,
yeah. And I'm just wondering if you're a demigod coming down on top of this thing, you're interacting by your mouse, but you haven't actually, how do I say it? You haven't actually interacted with the character except to cause them to do something because you're flying by. Are you actually interacting with the unit, or is it just reacting to your mouse? I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay, in Galactic Village, we're not trying to, I mean, you have interactions with it to the extent that just that really simple thing, that, I give an order, the unit does this acknowledgement, but most of the time the unit's just doing its thing.
Okay, so it's just
yeah, so we're not about, if you want to play that game, well, the person who wants to build the game that really exploits gestures is Peter Molyneux, who did the game Black and White. His game studio is now owned by Microsoft. And so Microsoft would have really, really liked it if he did a game that would have worked with the Kinect for the Kinect launch. Except the game he wanted to do wasn't something that Microsoft thought was a game. He wanted to do a game where there's this little boy who moves from England to the United States, and he's 8 or 10 years old, and he's bumming around Connecticut or somewhere, lonely and bored, and you interact with him and get him going and interested in life and get some activities going. Microsoft thinks this is not a game, but it would, if Peter Molyneux did it, it would rely very heavily on the kinds of things that you're talking about. Some wacko idea? Yeah.
I think I have a two-part question. I'm over here. Hi.
Hi. Sorry. Microphone's kind of mysterious.
I crawled underneath the table to go get the microphone. You didn't see me. At what point in the time, I guess, how long has the product been in development? At what point in the timeline did the science of gestures become a chosen strategy for this game?
Okay, so the gesture thing we've only been looking into for the past few months. The game has been in development for a few years, so we're looking at gesture as a solution for this particular problem. I hope we're not kind of forcing it. We'll find out really quickly when we do the testing whether we're forcing it or not.
Yeah.
And we're probably, in the game world, you can take an idea and run with it. If it seemed like that's where the fun was, we could go there. But we don't think that's where the primary fun is.
Right.
So we're probably not going to just sort of take a U-turn and get all into.
And that really was the second half of my question: is what portion of the goals of the game is gestures making up? How important a factor would this be? Part of your marketing message, that kind of.
Wow, part of your marketing message. I think I wouldn't talk about it in marketing really, although old industry hands were recently explaining to me that in the days of box games, it was always really helpful if you could write on the box, it uses XYZ. even if it was just kind of like an add-on or an ornament. But I don't think I would go with that. We have too many. Our marketing message is already way too complicated. We gotta shrink it down. I mean, because we're a massively multiplayer online strategy god game. Okay, we got to do better than that from a marketing point of view. Gesture, percent of development effort 3, maybe less.
This isn't so much a question as a comment wrapped around a suggestion. One of the great things about American Sign Language is that you can define things on the fly. So if I were going to tell you a story about a car accident, once I've got you to understand that my left hand is my car and the right hand is the police car, I can do an entire sentence that the police car passed me and then cut in front of me and then I turned to get away from it and then I spun over. Just by acting that out with my 2 hands.
Okay. In spoken languages, we create reference too. We do it in a different way. We do it by saying things like, the cat, it.
Right.
Right, okay, yeah.
So gesturally.
So that's what you're talking about, is setting up bunches of reference and then using them.
So, like, you have a gesture for hunger, and then there's a big one and a small one, and then you have a gesture for strength or whatever. But you might be able to take advantage of something like that and somehow say, this is what I'm talking about a lot. So I am hungry a lot. I am hungry a little.
Okay, we're almost headed that way a little bit. We're almost headed toward having negation. And the way that you would have negate, if we said doubling over is always means bad, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things you could combine with doubling over. But I hesitate to make too much of that because you don't want to have develop a language and have it be artificial and have. Peter Molyneux tried that in black and white, which is another reason we didn't think very hard about going that direction. In black and white, your avatar in the game is a hand. And you can do things like fling boulders around, you can pet your pet, you can smack your pet, you can take the little people and fling them around and do things like that. You can also cast spells with your hand. There's a whole system for casting spells with your hand. They call them miracles, but in other games they would be spells. It turned out mouse gesture spells, and even they had actually a data glove version. Did anybody ever try the data glove version? No. The spell thing was just...
Black and white.
RTS? 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 I don't remember who said what. The gesture part wasn't as much fun as flinging boulders around, that's a fact. And it turns out that in 2005, when they released Black and White 2, they neglected to put in the manual things like how to say, okay, I'm going to do a spell with a gesture, and I need the power up, and this is the spell. It wasn't in the manual. There were a lot of people who just couldn't do it, because they didn't know how. You had to learn.
Had you thought about, it seems like using the gestures to convey the status of the characters is interesting. It doesn't seem like the fun part of the game. So have you thought about whether there was a way to use the gestures to enhance more of the fun parts of the game?
Well, okay, so another way that we didn't go was a black and white way, which is to say, you're a demigod and you're going to have a hand. Somebody else did that. We're not trying to do that. I don't know of a better hook within the game for gesture. And so what that means is if this one doesn't pan out, we probably won't return to it because it would be in my back pocket. It might come in, there might be another opportunity, a case where it obviously came in handy, but I don't know of one right now. So you just have to find out whether this is good enough. I know there was another question.
When the unit's bent over, and if I'm arriving down, I thought they were bowing in acknowledgement.
Okay.
I really had to be taught that this had something to do with the health status.
Yes,
because that just wasn't anything to do with my mindset.
Okay, so this is good. This is a variant. Well, this is related to the idea that we have to tune them more for looking down on them. Okay, and you guys are all usability people, and any other comments that you have, I'm sure we'll appreciate.
All right. Any other questions?
This is just a comment, and it seems to me that gesture is probably a good tool when you're focusing on one unit and it's already caught your attention. But if you have the problem of drawing attention to a unit, you might do something, it might be more effective to do a static change. For instance, the unit is in trouble if shreds of their costume start falling off or they begin to drip blood. You might do something by varying the animation for their standard activity, whatever it is, to degrade it, to draw attention to a unit in trouble. But the kind of gesture that you're using for status indication when you're directly interacting with the unit just seems to me too slow, too complicated to be suitable for that draw attention to the unit in trouble role.
Okay, so you would prefer the design where they signal for help first or something. I think the reason we didn't do the blood dripping route is because it would be too small to see. But the idea of sort of doing a general thing to attract help actually is will be even more important when we get to the problem of, well, so how are buildings going to communicate? A unit that's a farm or a city. And in fact, Civ 5 has, apparently, the cities do smoke signals. So they can at least tell you one or two things. I don't know if they do a lot of detailed signaling. Probably not, but yeah. Yeah, I understand what your point is there.
All right, thank you very much.